I'm Dr. Behzad Bernous, though many people know me simply as Dr. B or Dr. BB. Imagine walking into three different therapists' offices. The first one tells you your depression is caused by changes in your brain chemistry. The second one says your suffering comes from unconscious conflicts that your psyche is trying to communicate through dreams and symbols. And the third one says, your consciousness creates your experience of reality, and healing begins with transforming awareness itself. All three therapists are highly educated. All three of them want genuinely to help you. And all three use treatment supported by research. Yet, they begin from completely different assumptions about one fundamental question. What is the human mind? Today, I want to explore the three major philosophical traditions that shape nearly every approach to the treatment of mental health. Most clinicians probably are not even aware that they are working within one of these traditions. Yet every diagnosis, every therapy, and every medication recommendation rests upon one of these philosophical foundations. So what are the three main philosophical traditions running the mental health perspectives? The materialist view, the idealist view, the dualist view, or as they call it, classical view of the psyche are the main theoretical perspectives. Now, let's talk about the first one, the materialist view. This first tradition, and by far the dominant one in modern medicine, is materialism. Materialism proposes that matter is fundamental. Your brain creates your mind. Consciousness is what the brain does. And when neurons stop functioning, consciousness ends. From this perspective, emotions, thoughts, memories, personality, and even love are product of neural activity. Mental illness, therefore, becomes a disorder of the brain. For example, depression reflects altered neurotransmitter level, anxiety involves dysregulated threat system, ADHD reflects deficits in executive functioning, and schizophrenia involves disruptions in dopamine and neural connectivity. So based on this tradition, if the brain changes, the mind changes. This approach has produced enormous advances, such as modern psychiatry, neuroscience, brain imaging, and psychopharmacology, among so many other. And these behavioral sciences, many treatments with strong scientific evidence that they emerge from this worldview. To give some examples, we can mention behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, exposure therapy, EMDR, medication management, TMS, neurofeedback, and other behavioral medicine approaches. Also, many influential thinkers represent this perspective. For example, Robert Sapolsky examines how biology shapes behavior. His famous book, Determined, is a good example. Richard Dawkins emphasizes evolutionary explanation for human nature. And Patricia and Paul Churchland argue that neuroscience may eventually replace traditional psychological explanations. The strength of this approach is its ability to produce measurable, testable interventions. Its criticism is that subjective experience may become reduced to brain chemistry alone. Second tradition. The second tradition of the idealist view asks a completely different question. It asks as, what if consciousness comes first? Rather than asking, how does the brain create the mind? It actually asks, What if the brain appears within the consciousness? This is the philosophical idealism. Here, consciousness is primary and matter is secondary. The brain is not necessarily the producer of consciousness. Actually, it may instead function more like a filter or receiver. One of the most influential contemporary proponents of this system is Bernardo Kastrup and his analytical idealism. He argues that consciousness is the fundamental reality and that the physical world is how consciousness appears from a particular perspective. Donald Hoffman similarly argues that evolution did not shape us to perceive objective reality, but rather useful interfaces. Within this framework, psychological suffering is understood primarily as a disturbance in consciousness. Healing then involves transforming awareness itself. This perspective has influenced many schools such as transpersonal psychology, contemplative psychology, non-dual psychotherapy, and many psychedelic treatment approaches. Also, some meditation-based approaches. Its greatest strength is that it takes subjective experience seriously. And maybe its greatest challenge is that many of its central claims remain difficult to test empirically. Okay, now let's talk about the third tradition. The third tradition of the dualist view or classical view of psyche is perhaps the oldest one. It argues that psyche cannot be reduced to either neurons or abstract consciousness alone, and that the psyche possesses its own reality. Also, that psyche has conscious and unconscious aspects. It is important to mention that neuroscience has recently proved the existence of unconscious, as vast majority of our brain activities are happening out of scope of consciousness. This is where Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, Melanie Klein, and others entered the conversation. They never believed that the unconscious was merely brain activities. Carl Jung proposed that beneath our personal unconscious lies a collective unconscious that is shared by all humanity. That dreams are not random neural firings, they are communications from the psyche. And also that symbols are not simply learned associations. They reveal organizing principles that Jung called them archetypes. In this approach, healing therefore becomes a dialogue with the psyche. The goal is not just symptom reduction, but becoming aware of our own unconscious in order to become a full version of the self, to achieve individuation. This tradition includes approaches such as analytical psychology, depth psychology, psychodynamic therapy, object relation, self-psychology, existential therapy, logotherapy, and also psychosynthesis. Other thinkers associated with this broader tradition, we can name James Hillman, Robert Assagioli, Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, and Erwin Yalom, for example. Although these thinkers differ in many ways, they all regard psychological life as containing meaning that cannot be fully explained by biology alone. Okay, now let's see why therapists often disagree. One therapist might recommend medication, another explores childhood attachment, one focuses on dreams, another might teaches mindfulness, one might encourages meditation. So, who is correct after all? Perhaps each therapist is answering a different question. One is treating the brain, one is treating learned behavior, one is possibly treating the psyche, and the other one might be cultivating awareness. Their interventions follows naturally from their assumptions about what a human being fundamentally is. Now, let us talk integration. Perhaps the future of mental health does not belong to one philosophy alone. George Engel's biopsychosocial model of 1977 reminds us that biology, psychology, and social context all matter. Ken Wilber attempts to integrate biology, mind, culture, and spirituality into a single framework of biopsychosociocultural, and spiritual is another attempt to integrate all systems. Family system theories reminds us that symptoms could emerge within relationships and could be passed down through generations. As clinicians, we may eventually recognize that different clients or different presentations require different level of understanding and approaches. Some might really need medication, such as schizophrenia, ADHD, or bipolar, and some situations might need behavioral change. And some other presentations, such as trauma, might need different approach like EMDR and trauma work. Some presentation might need existential approach and meaning, such as midlife crisis. And maybe at times a spiritual transformation is the core issue. So no single model explains every human experience. Perhaps the most important question is not which model is correct. Maybe the better question is, what aspect of the human being is suffering? Is it the brain? Is it the conditioned mind, the unconscious, relationship issues, meaning, consciousness itself? So the answer may differ from one person to another, a case by case. And perhaps wisdom in psychology is not choosing one philosophy while rejecting all others. Perhaps it is knowing when each perspective offers the clearest lens through which to understand the person sitting in front of us. Now that we have explored the major philosophies of the mind, let's discuss the professionals who provide mental health care. Who are these mental health professionals? Many people assume that all therapists receive the same education and provide the same type of treatment. In reality, each profession has a different educational background, different areas of expertise, and a different emphasis in training. These differences influence how clinicians understand psychological suffering and how they approach treatment. It is also important to remember that professional education provides the foundation, while additional postgraduate training often shapes a clinician-specific therapeutic approach. So let's start with the first group, psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are physicians who complete medical school, followed by special training in psychiatry. Because they're medical doctors, their education emphasizes medicine, neuroscience, pharmacology, and other biological bases of mental illness. Psychiatrists are uniquely qualified to diagnose psychiatric disorders, prescribe medications, evaluate the medical cause of psychiatric symptoms, and integrate mental health with general medical care. Although some psychiatrists also provide psychotherapy, many primarily focus on medication management. Historically, psychiatry has been most closely associated with the brain-centered or medical model of mental health, while some psychiatrists pursue psychoanalytical approaches as well. The second group are clinical psychologists. Clinical psychologists complete a doctoral degree in psychology, either a PhD or PsyD. Their education focuses on human behavior, cognition, emotion, personality, development, psychopathology, research, and also psychological assessment. Psychologists receive extensive training in psychological testing and are uniquely qualified to administer, interpret, and integrate psychological testing and neuropsychological evaluation. These assessments may include evaluation for ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, personality disorders, and even forensic evaluations. Clinical psychologists also provide psychotherapy using a wide variety of theoretical orientation, including cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, existential, family system, and other approaches as we talked about. Because psychology encompasses many schools of thought, psychologists may practice within the brain-centered, psyche-centered, or even consciousness-centered paradigms. The third groups are licensed marriage and family therapists, or LMFTs. They complete a master's degree in marriage and family therapy or a closely related field. Their education emphasizes relationships, communication, family dynamics, attachment, and interpersonal systems. Rather than viewing symptoms only as individual problems, LMFTs often understand psychological difficulties within the context of couples, families, and relational patterns. Most LMFTs specialize in psychotherapy rather than psychological testing. The fourth groups are licensed clinical social workers, or LCSWs. Licensed clinical social workers complete a Master's of Social Work and advanced clinical training. Their perspective emphasizes the interaction between individuals and their environment. Social workers consider not only psychological symptoms, but also trauma, family system, community resources, socioeconomic factors, culture, and social justice. Many LCSWs provide psychotherapy while also helping clients navigate practical and challenges that impacting their daily lives. The fifth group are licensed professional clinical counselors, or LPCC. Professional clinical counselors complete a master's degree in counseling or clinical mental health counseling. Their education focuses on emotional well-being, human development, coping skills, life transitions, and psychotherapy. Many LPCCs practice from cognitive behavioral, person-centered, humanistic, or integrative perspectives while developing additional specialties throughout their careers. The sixth group are psychiatric mental health nurse practitioners, or PMHNP. These nurse practitioners have advanced practice education and they complete Masters of Science in Nursing and sometimes Doctor of Nursing practice. And they specialize in psychiatric mental health. Their education combines nursing, medicine, and psychiatry. Depending on the state law, they may diagnose psychiatric disorders, prescribe medication, and provide psychotherapy. Their approach often integrates biological treatment with the holistic patient care. The seventh group are psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis is not a separate professional license, but an advanced postgraduate specialization. Psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, counselors, and other licensed professionals may pursue psychoanalytic training after completing their primary education. Psychoanalysis focuses on unconscious processes, childhood development, personality organization, defense mechanism, and therapeutic relationship that emphasize is understanding the deeper psychological roots of the problem, rather than attending to the symptoms. The eighth group are Jungian analysts. Like psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis is an advanced postgraduate specialization rather than a separate profession. Many Jungian analysts begin their career as psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, social workers, physicians, or other mental health professionals before completing specialized training in analytical psychology. Their work emphasizes dreams, symbols, mythology, archetypes, spirituality, and the lifelong process of individuation. Rather than asking only how to eliminate symptoms, they ask what meaning the symptoms may hold and how they contribute to psychological growth. Then we also have the ninth group, or spiritual and contemplative practitioners, beyond the licensed mental health professionals that practice, and their main focus are spiritual growth and development of consciousness rather than the diagnosis and treatment of mental health disorders. These may include meditation teachers, mindfulness instructors, spiritual directors, clergy and chaplains, Buddhist teachers, and yoga therapists. We also have life coaches that goes within the same category. Their work often emphasizes things such as meditation, mindfulness, prayer, compassion, self-awareness, meaning, spiritual development, and also inner transformation. Unlike licensed mental health professionals, these practitioners generally do not diagnose mental disorders or provide psychological assessment, although some individuals may hold a professional license as well as doing their own spiritual practices. For many people, spiritual practice can complement psychotherapy by fostering resilience, giving purpose and support, as spiritual practices can substitute for so many of shortcomings while cannot totally cover the needs for issues such as mental health disorders, psychosis, or severe functional impairments. The most effective care often occurs when psychological treatment and authentic spiritual practice complement one another rather than competing. One important point to mention here is that why different professionals may recommend different treatments. Imagine that 9 different practitioners evaluate the same individual who has developed panic attacks following a painful divorce. A psychiatrist may begin by asking whether changes in brain chemistry, anxiety, or depression has made this situation worse, and he may recommend medication, psychotherapy, or a combination of both. A psychologist may first conduct a comprehensive psychological evaluation to clarify the diagnosis, assess personality, identify cognitive and emotional pattern, and determine which evidence-based treatment is likely to be more effective. A marriage family therapist may focus on the individual's relationships, attachment style, communication pattern, and family dynamics, exploring how relational experiences have contributed to this current issue. A licensed clinical social worker may examine the person's broader environment, including trauma, social support, financial stress, and community resources, recognizing that emotional suffering occurs within a larger system. A licensed professional clinical counselor may emphasize emotional wellness, coping strategies, resilience, life transition, and give some practical steps in order to help this person. A psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner may evaluate both the person's psychiatric symptoms and overall physical health, as well as considering the stressors and what are impacting the individual at this time in a holistic approach. A psychoanalyst may pay attention to the unconscious dynamics that might be contributing to the current issue, such as repetition compulsion. A Jungian analyst may ask what symbolic or developmental meaning this crisis holds, rather than viewing the divorce just as a problem to overcome. He might explore whether it represents something deeper that could help the person to achieve greater self-awareness and take another step in his or her individuation process. And a spiritual or contemplative practitioner, such as a meditation teacher or spiritual director or a mindful instructor, may guide the individual towards practices that cultivate awareness, acceptance, compassion, inner peace, and growth. The focus is not on diagnosing mental disorder, but developing a different relationship with the suffering itself and discovering meaning through this contemplation. Let's notice that each practitioner begins with a different question. One asks what is happening in the brain. Other asks what does the psychological assessment reveals. One asks what happened within this person's relationship, while the other paying attention to how the environment has contributed to this suffering. The other might say what coping skills needed to be developed, while another might look at the biological and psychological care that needs to be integrated. The other might pay attention to the unconscious conflicts that are being triggered, while the other might look at the symbolic meaning of this suffering, and the other pay attention to how we can make this as a growth process. None of these perspectives is inherently right or wrong. Each practitioner brings valuable knowledge and expertise, but each understands psychological suffering through a different lens and an educational background, as well as philosophical orientation. Ultimately, mental health care is not simply about choosing the best professional. It is about finding the professional whose training, philosophy, and methods are the best fit for the individual and the challenges that the one is facing. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding in mental health is believing that a professional title alone tells us how someone practices. In reality, 3 different factors shape every clinician. The first is their profession, which determines the type of education they received and the scope of practice for which they were trained. The second is their theoretical orientation, which reflects how they understand the human mind and psychological suffering. And the third one is their specialized training, which determines the therapeutic methods they actually use in clinical practice. This means that 2 psychologists may approach the same client very differently if one practices CBT and the other practices Jungian analysis. Likewise, a psychiatrist, psychologist, marriage family therapist, or social worker may practice remarkably different if they pursue the same advanced therapeutic training. Ultimately, the letters after a clinician's name tells us what they were educated to do. Their philosophy tells us how they understand human nature, and their specialized training tells us how they attempt to help people heal. But most important of all, their personality gives us the opportunity of feeling connected and understood, which is the most important factor in promoting healing. At the end, I like to add that do not stop your own journey in finding answers for your questions, and do not shy away from trying several different mental health practitioners if needed, till you find one that clicks with you. As usual, thank you very much for your time and attention to this episode. Till next time, have a great day.